Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians, where the past is not just remembered, but brought back to life with depth and clarity. At dawn, the Colosseum was already awake. Its towering arches drank in the first thin light of morning, while yesterday's blood still stained the stone like a lingering memory. Beneath the seething tears, merchants shouted over one another, baskets heavy with olives and diluted wine, preparing for a crowd that had yet to arrive. Behind iron gates, handlers forced half-starved beasts into position, lions with ribs pressing against skin, panthers slashing at bars, elephants stamping in furious protest. From the tunnels echoed the sharp ring of metal, not practice blows, but blades being tested for real killing. Above it all, a low murmur grew into a roar as tens of thousands of Romans poured in, hungry for what their empire mastered better than anything else: death disguised as spectacle. The Roman arena was never just entertainment, it was a machine for control. Emperors flooded the sand to stage mock naval battles, starved animals to sharpen suspense, and forced prisoners to reenact myths that ended with real bodies on the ground. None of it was random. Cruelty was policy. Applause was obedience. Each cheer was loyalty shouted into history. Here at Crimson Legacy Historians, we step directly into that shadow. These are the most brutal, most inhumane arena acts that push the limits, even for Rome. From blood-soaked funeral rites to executions masked as theater, we uncover how an empire built glory by turning suffering into applause. If you're drawn to history's darker truths, subscribe now and join us as we descend further. Now, take your seat. The gates are opening. Gladiatorial combat in Rome did not begin with emperors or marble arenas. It began at a funeral. In 264 BC, the sons of Decimus, Junius, Brutus, Sceva honored their father not with prayers or monuments, but with blood. 3 pairs of enslaved men were armed and ordered to fight to the death in the Forum Boarium, a cattle market thick with smoke, filth, and decay. This was not sport, it was munus, a sacred obligation to the dead. The tradition reached back beyond Rome. In Campania, warriors were slain at graves to calm restless spirits. Over time, ritual killing transformed into combat. Death was no longer random, it was staged. Rome adopted the practice eagerly, influenced by its Samnite enemies. Lavish funerals once proved wealth. Blood-drenched funerals proved power. By the 3rd century BC, Rome's leaders recognized something more. These spectacles could stabilize politics. Religious festivals, once solemn offerings to the gods, began to feature gladiators. The Senate called it devotion. The crowd understood the truth. State-sponsored violence designed to keep the people loyal. Even the armor told stories. Early fighters wore the shapes of conquered foes, the Samnite with his heavy shield, the Thracian with a curved blade, the Gaul with a broad sword. Watching them bleed was watching Rome's victories replayed slash after slash. Death became propaganda, and as blood spilled, the venues grew. Temporary wooden stands gave way to permanent amphitheaters, temples to violence where thousands gathered. The games no longer belonged to grieving families, they belonged to the state. Each drop of blood whispered the same message. Rome commanded men, armies, even death itself. No one then could have guessed how far it would go. What started as ritual sacrifice morphed into theater and duty, became obsession. Rome had discovered a new weapon power over not just the living, but the meaning of dying. And once unleashed, it never closed that door. The crowd's roar wasn't reserved for men. Sometimes it thundered for beasts hauled from the farthest edges of the known world. Lions from North Africa, leopards from the Caucasus, crocodiles from the Nile, even giraffes dragged across deserts. They weren't displayed as wonders of nature, but condemned as prey in a carnival of slaughter. Romans called these shows venations, hunts. They weren't about survival, but about domination, proof the empire could trap the wild and destroy it for pleasure. Julius Caesar set the tone in 46 BC. Parading a giraffe, the first ever seen in Europe. They called it a camelopod, half camel, half leopard, because Rome had no name for such a creature. It didn't matter. The animal wasn't admired. It was thrown into the sand to be torn apart. The message was unmistakable. If Rome could seize the strangest beasts alive, it could conquer anything. The slaughter only grew. When the Colosseum opened in AD 80, Emperor Titus reportedly oversaw the deaths of more than 9,000 animals in one festival. Archaeologists have found bones etched with marks of deliberate starvation, evidence that lions and bears were weakened beforehand to ensure a quick, bloody kill. Even elephants, once the terror of Roman legions under Hannibal, were herded into the arena and butchered for cheers. Behind the scenes, logistics were part of the theater. Exotic creatures had to be trapped, hauled across deserts, kept alive just long enough to meet their doom. Caravans dragged chains through scorching sands, delivering victims to a city that demanded fresh blood with every sunrise. Caravans dragged cages across deserts, fleets floated them down the Nile, and handlers risked their lives just to deliver living trophies to Rome. Seeing a panther in the wild was dangerous enough. Watching one explode from a cage in front of 50,000 screaming spectators, that was power made visible. Every creature was a living souvenir of conquest, proof that the empire's reach knew no limits. Some emperors made these hunts their own PR. Ivate stages. Comiotus, Rome's most flamboyant showman, strode into the arena dressed as Hercules, slaughtering hundreds of animals himself. He wanted to look like a god among beasts, but everyone could see the truth, a fragile ego with a bow. The hunts were often rigged. Animals were chained, maimed, or half-starved, so the emperor could bask in a guaranteed victory. And the people, they cheered, not because they admired him, but because when the emperor hunts, silence could be fatal. Behind the cheers, a quieter tragedy unfolded. Ancient writers like Pliny the Elder warned how rare species vanished from their homelands after decades of Roman slaughter. Lions, leopards, and even elephants were pushed toward extinction to feed the empire's appetite for spectacle. The Colosseum wasn't just a theater of death, it was an ecological wrecking ball. But for Rome, extinction didn't matter. What mattered was the illusion that nature itself could be captured, starved, and destroyed for fun. Every carcass on the sand was another brick in the wall of imperial control. When you picture a gladiator, you might imagine two evenly matched warriors locked in noble combat. The reality was far more twisted. Rome thrived on imbalance, on contests engineered for cruelty. They built bizarre weapons, imposed absurd rules, and staged fights no one could truly win. Some victims weren't fighters at all. Prisoners and condemned criminals were shoved into the arena dressed as clowns, handed wooden swords, and sent to die against seasoned killers. The crowd jeered as the doomed flailed and fell. Public execution neatly disguised as sport. Even the weapons became characters. The retiers fought with a fisherman's net and trident, squaring off against the Caesar, whose smooth, rounded helmet was designed to deflect the net. It wasn't pure skill, it was suspense. A living riddle of whether the net would ensnare or the sword would break through. Romans devoured that tension even when the match was as scripted as a stage play. The numbers grew more obscene. Sometimes one gladiator was thrown against several foes. Other days entire units clashed like miniature armies, turning the arena floor into a swamp of blood, splintered shields, and mangled corpses. And when novelty wore thin, they reached further. Female gladiators. Gladiatrices stepped onto the sand in the 1st century AD. Writers like Juvenal mocked them, yet records prove they fought for real against dwarfs, against beasts, even against each other. Their presence blurred gender lines but reinforced a darker truth. No one, man or woman, was beyond Rome's hunger for spectacle. Even the helmets were weapons of torment. Some narrowed vision or muffled sound, forcing fighters to stumble half-blind while the audience roared with laughter. Others were so heavy that raising one's head became a contest all its own. Armor wasn't always protection, sometimes it was punishment. And then came the propaganda plays. Gladiators dressed as barbarians, forced to mimic Rome's defeated enemies. Their inevitable loss reminded everyone that the empire always prevailed. Every mismatch, every exotic twist, every gender-bending stunt was carefully designed to keep crowds shocked, obedient, and begging for more. The Colosseum never settled for repetition. It invented new cruelties, always hunting for the next thrill. By midday, once the morning jewels had soaked the sand and the crowd started to fidget, the arena shifted gears. Combat gave way to theater with death at center stage. Romans called it damnio ad bestas, condemnation to the beasts. For the condemned, it wasn't a trial. It was a script they had no power to refuse. Criminals, deserters, rebellious slaves, prisoners of war. They all became unwilling actors in an execution disguised as myth. Each victim's punishment matched their crime. Thieves torn apart by wolves. Arsonists burned alive, traitors thrown to lions. Every scene was a morality play written in real blood, and the scale could stagger belief. During Emperor Trajan's celebrations after his day in victory, thousands of captives were slaughtered over 103 relentless days. It wasn't random carnage, it was organized, paced like acts in a grim drama, every death crafted to keep the audience on edge until the next horror arrived. Animals were the stars of this nightmare. Lions were starved to a frenzy before release. Bears chained in pits were goaded into sudden fury. Even prized leopards were unleashed on Trem. Bling victims. The uncertainty, would the beast strike fast or toy with its prey, kept the stands howling for more. Sometimes the cruelty came dressed as legend. Prisoners were forced to play doomed heroes. Orpheus torn apart by wild beasts. Prometheus chained as vultures circled overhead. These weren't stories anymore. They were blood-soaked performances, and the sand was their stage. Death in Rome wasn't always just death. Sometimes it was theater. Bloody, mocking theater. For the condemned, it wasn't enough to perish. They had to perform their demise, acting out Rome's myths with their own bodies. Executions became grotesque plays where flesh replaced masks, and the script always ended in agony. The cruelty stretched far beyond wild beasts. Crucifixion borrowed from the East was staged right inside the arena. Men and women were nailed to timber while vendors hawked wine and children played nearby. Fire joined the spectacle too. Prisoners were forced into the tuna molester. A shirt soaked in pitch, then set ablaze. Human torches writhing as smoke curled into the sky. As Tertullian bitterly wrote, they were living torches. These killings weren't just morbid entertainment. They were propaganda warnings carved into living flesh. Defy Rome and you would die slowly with tens of thousands watching. Not everyone could stomach it. Seneca complained that midday executions hardened the soul, making men cruel as they watched, but his protests drowned in the thunder of a crowd that came no for justice, but for the thrill of punishment. Rome's imagination didn't stop with sand and swords. Sometimes emperors demanded oceans inside the city. Mock naval battles, now amachi, were spectacles on an insane scale where water itself became a weapon. Julius Caesar set the precedent in 46 BC, digging an enormous basin near the Tiber, filling it with water and real ships. Thousands of doomed captives were shoved aboard and told to fight as rival fleets. They weren't actors. They were men condemned to die for applause. Arrows, catapults, and steel turned the basin into a slaughterhouse afloat. Augustus expanded the madness. In 2 BC, he created a basin almost 2,000 times 1,200 Roman feet, fed by a custom aqueduct, the Aqua Alcatina, just to keep it full. 30 warships clashed there, each crammed with prisoners, fated never to leave alive. The message: Rome could command seas where none existed, even nature bent to imperial whim. By 52 AD, Claudius went further, draining Lake Fucine to stage another Machaea. When the captives greeted him with the chilling salute, moi salutant, those who are about to die salute you, history gained one of its most haunting lines. Whether rehearsed or desperate, it summed up the hopelessness of men made into props. Fire, too, had its macabre myths. Victims wearing the pitch-soaked tunic were cast as heroes meeting fiery fates. Hercules consumed by poison, or Mucius Sciola testing loyalty by holding his hand to the flames. The crowd laughed as these heroes screamed, their bravery reduced to ash, their stories turned to mockery. Even the Colosseum's architecture fed Rome's appetite for domination. Under Titus and later Domitian, engineers built channels beneath the arena, allowing the sand to flood for smaller naval shows, then drain for combat the next day. Cruelty became an engineering project. Water, fire, flesh, everything was a prop in Rome's theater of control. To drown captives, to turn bodies into living torches, to bend myths into slaughter, that was power. The emperors weren't satisfied ruling men. They posed as rulers of the elements themselves. By the late 1st century, executions weren't punishments anymore. They were scripts dripping with creative malice, twisting cultural legends into tools of humiliation. Take the games inaugurating the Colosseum in AD 80. The poet Martial recorded an actor cast as Orpheus, the musician who tamed beasts with song. In myth, animals sat enchanted by his lyre. In the arena, a bear was released mid-pea performance and mauled the singer to death. Art turned to parody, beauty to butchery. Another victim was forced to play Daedalus, the inventor who escaped sit on waxen wings, suspended on a crude contraption meant to mimic flight. He soared briefly before plunging to the beasts below. Martial quipped, "The man must have wished for real feathers, a poet's chest hiding a man's terror." Perhaps the most grotesque of all, the myth of Pacifier, cursed to desire a bull. One show staged her eye. Infamous union with a mechanical beast, followed by a killing that blurred execution, humiliation, and pornography. A warning about hubris became public degradation. The message was clear. Rome owned its myths just as it owned its people. Heroes, villains, kings, queens. None were safe from being rewritten as props in a pageant of death. For spectators, these scenes were sideshows between serious contests. For the condemned, they were agonizing ends dressed in costumes. For Rome, they were propaganda made flesh, proving the state could even rewrite the meaning of its own legends. In the Colosseum, stories weren't told with ink or marble. They were branded into skin, burned into bone, and applauded until silence swallowed the sand. The line between rule and raw obsession blurred until an emperor's whim decided who lived, who died, and how. Caligula, infamous for his savage moods, once ran out of animals mid-show and casually ordered spectators dragged from the stands to fill the gap. They came to watch bloodshed, only to become part of it. Nero, addicted to his own image, treated the arena as a personal stage. Prisoners were dressed as tragic heroes from plays, then executed in ways that mirrored their scripted fates. Nero called it art. Rome whispered, "Madness." And then came Commodus, the ultimate showman emperor. Cloaked as Hercules, he stormed into the Colosseum with club and bow, slaughtering hundreds of animals crippled, beforehand to guarantee applause. He even billed the tea. Reggery for his performances, bleeding the state dry while forcing cheers from a terrified crowd. Not satisfied, he faced gladiators too, but only with every advantage rigged in his favor. Losing was impossible. Clapping was compulsory. Domitian wielded the arena like a weapon of paranoia, staging midnight hunts by torchlight to keep Rome uneasy, unsure when amusement might turn to terror. Even good emperors weren't immune. Trajan, remembered as just and capable, marked victory with 103 days of games. Thousands of deaths folded into a celebration of power. Spectacle fed egos, but it carried a price. Caligula and Commodus both died violently, remembered not for statecraft, but for theater written in blood. The arena that lifted them up also exposed their madness. Not every Roman cheered. Philosophers, poets, early Christians left a quieter record, one that saw rot beneath the marble. Seneca confessed the midday executions hardened him, stripping away empathy rather than purifying the soul. Violence, he warned, seeped past the arena walls, poisoning daily life. Cicero, decades before, praised bravery, yet condemned cruelty for cruelty's sake, though even he admitted the mob demanded games as proof of generosity. To govern meant feeding the beast. For Christians, the amphitheater was both persecution and proof. Those who refused to renounce their faith were thrown to lions or burned alive, their deaths twisted into mass entertainment. Tertullian called the shows seeds of cruelty, indicting an empire that cheered injustice as sport. Economically, the games devoured fortunes. By late empire, rulers bankrupted themselves, chasing spectacles grand enough to outshine predecessors. What once flaunted strength became an act of desperation. Culturally, the appetite dulled Rome's edge. Citizens who once honored discipline now demanded cheap bread and endless circuses. Juvenal mocked this hunger with the phrase "Pam, etc." to him. The craving for spectacle betrayed how far Rome had drifted from its republican roots. As frontiers cracked and funds dried up, the arenas crumbled. By the 5th century, the Colosseum, still colossal, stood hollow, its sand silent, its roars gone. But the moral questions never faded. Could a society that trained its people to revel in suffering truly endure? History's verdict suggests otherwise. Today, the Colosseum looms, scarred but proud. Walk its tunnels and you might still hear echoes, iron clashing, beasts roaring, 50,000 voices rising as one. The stone is easy to admire. Harder and more honest is to remember its purpose. Cruelty rehearsed until it felt normal. Rome's arenas weren't merely about blood, they were about control, shaping how citizens thought, laughed, and obeyed.